In this YouTube tutorial, we are going to take a look at a Misty Forest reference photo and paint that gorgeous watercolor piece from it. It's really only a few simple steps, and I totally think that you can do this. So let's gather all of your materials and jump right in. Next up, we're going to paint this like moody, misty forest. And this time, instead of using the same orientation like of the paper as the reference photo, I just switched it up so that I'm doing more of a vertical orientation here. So only part of the shot's going to be here, but it's still going to be fun. So first things first, we're going to get the first part of our paper wet, and I would say like the top third of your paper, we're going to get, maybe the top half actually, we're going to get wet with clean water, and then with a very, very light, and light meaning lots of water. We're going to add lots of water to like a Payne's gray or a dark blue to mimic this kind of gray up here. You can also get a really watery black to mimic the gray. And it's just going to add like a light sheen, so it's not, the paper isn't quite white anymore. And we're going to put that gray on the first like 3/4 of the wet part, and then along the bottom of the wet part we're going to take some dark green and add it to just along the bottom so we can mimic this fog here. And so we're going to take the dark green and push it upward into the fog, into the gray area. And so you're starting from the bottom and just pushing it upward, this watery dark green that you have. And then taking a clean brush, just kind of tap along with your clean watery brush, tap along the top there to further encourage the green to blend upward into the sky in that misty kind of manner. And so you can add even darker green along the bottom once you've done that. The thing with watercolor is you can always go darker if you need to. It's way harder to go lighter once you've already placed dark pigment. It's hard to remove the dark pigment, but you can always go darker if you need to. So I would recommend when doing like layered mist like this, that you start with lighter, so more watery paint than you think you might need, and then add darker paint, layer on the darker paint afterward. So that's kind of what we're doing here, and that's what we're doing to get this misty effect. So now that we have the misty effect that we want, we're just going to bring down some of this dark paint. We're doing this painting in 2 layers, and so we're just bringing down a little bit of the dark paint with some clean water, just so we don't have like a dried paint line where we don't want it. And so we can bring it, you don't have to bring it down all the way because we're going to cover up this bottom half with paint in our second layer, but we just want to bring it down so that up here is not like a stark line where the green was. And it's easier to do that and still maintain the like the dark moody blends that you made if you do it after you've already done it, and then after you've already made the blends upward, and then you can go back and add even more here, just like that, until you feel satisfied. And so this is the first layer, and then we're going to move on to the second and final layer of this loose watercolor misty mountain. Now that the first layer is dry, we are going to paint the rest of this piece using kind of chunky wet on wet strokes to form the rest of the layers. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm taking some clean water and just along the side and through the middle of this painting here, I am painting a nice big like stripe of clean water, and that's where I'm going to put this line of trees. But then there's also this hillside down here that I want to showcase, and so I'm making sure to leave some space in between. I'm not doing just like a solid line of water. As I move down to the other parts of this piece, I'm going to use white space and dry space in the paper to separate these layers without having to do another layer. So we're going to keep painting, and then that technique will be more apparent as we move on to the different tree layers. So first things first, I'm going to take some dark green. Now that I have this like wet little stripe here, I'm going to take some dark green and just paint a bunch of thin lines down into the swatch of water that I have there. And these are obviously to just like represent the line of trees that we're going to paint right here. And so because I'm painting a big line, when I do like these loose watercolor scenes, it is way easier instead of doing individual trees one at a time. And because I'm not really caring so much about being super realistic, it's way easier to paint these lines first and then go back in with like thin horizontal lines and just like paint thin horizontal lines across all of these trunks. And you see how these trees, you can't even tell the different trees anyway. They're all kind of bunched together in groups. That also makes this technique an excellent one, because trying to paint individual trees to still look like they're in a bunch like that would be pretty difficult. And so we're just using our paint and using the trunks as kind of guidelines as to where to put these thin lines, thin watery dark lines that we're painting on here. And so I'm painting across multiple tree trunks at a time, still trying to maintain the like thinner at the top and then thicker at the bottom, and still definitely having some white space in between the lines, just so you can see, you know, that these are pine trees, the different pine needles in here. So while these trunks are still wet and while the bottom is still wet, we're just painting along the sides, leaving behind white space between these thin lines that are going across the trunks, just so that we have a little bit of detail on those trees, but painting them all clumped together like that, so that you can't really tell which individual tree is which. You just see this line, this thick line of trees. And then, while this swatch is still wet, we're going to like push even more water in some parts to mimic some of the mist that's coming down here. And so I'm going to push some of the pigment down, and then other times, or even add darker pigment along the bottom here. And that's if by like adding dark pigment along the bottom and leaving some of this like lighter pigment in the middle, that's going to help give the effect of mist like invading or intruding on this mountainside, on this line of trees. So we're just kind of painting around the mist and using the wet on wet technique to make it even more pronounced in some places. So, and then once again, as I mentioned, you know, in the earlier project we did, I'm not really paying much attention to where my paintbrush is going. I'm just kind of letting it move around on its own and then taking stock of where it is and adding water if I need to, if I feel like I need to, like to showcase the mist more over here, or adding more paint to make more contrast. Either way, I'm just kind of letting that run free, I guess. And now I'm going to move on to the hillside down here. And so I'm going to use some clean water, and in some places I'm going to have this clean water touch the wet spot up here so that they can blend together, but I'm going to leave it dry in other places so that there's still like a line in between where this hill is going to be and in between and where this tree line is, if that makes sense, because I'm trying to do all of this in like one layer. And so, you know, using my imagination to believe that this like dry negative space, white space that we leave in between these two spots can represent the difference in depth between the hill and that mountain. And so then I'm just going to take some like lighter green that I have and paint the hillside just like this, leaving behind some of that white space like I mentioned. And then I'm gonna do the same thing with this like grassy area down here. So I'm just gonna like have this be that grassy, more yellowy area. And then paint around it once I paint the top. So my goal here is, instead of painting everything in like all these different layers, I'm just trying to loosely capture a lot of these layers using only one paint layer, if that makes sense, and letting the white space of the paper separate the different layers, and also letting your imagination know that, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect in order to look cool. So I am gonna focus on this hill for right now. I want to add some darker green to represent some of this foliage over here. And this time I don't need it to be super realistic, meaning this is still wet, and that's okay that this is still wet while I'm painting these like tufts of shrubbery. If I were trying to go for a more realistic look, then I would instead wait for this to dry and paint the shrubbery on top of the dry hill. But because I'm not going for a super realistic look here, I'm okay with the using like darker green and the wet on wet technique to help form these trees along the hill. And then if you want it to look not so wild and crazy, you can still use the wet on wet technique, but just less water. So I'm using some very dense pigment here, not very much water in my paint as I'm picking it up. And because there's not very much water in my paint, even though I'm painting on this wet surface, it's not really going anywhere. It's just kind of being fuzzy. It's kind of being blurry. And that is the kind of look that we're trying to achieve with adding these areas of like dark shrubbery on this lighter hillside. And so just making sure there's not tons of water on your paintbrush and not tons of water in your paint as you're adding it. And then I'm going to take just a little bit of like yellow ochre and paint this little hill that's kind of running down the side, this path that's running down the side of this hill. Just in like this kind of S-curve squiggle kind of manner. And then to finish this painting, I'm going to take a little bit more yellow ochre and paint some grass coming up in this area right here. So I'm going to paint some grass, and I'm painting this grass in like thin strokes coming from the bottom of the page. And notice how my grassy area is still wet, and so the grass here is blurry, but because I'm painting in thin strokes and using like heavily pigmented yellow ochre, I can still kind of see the lines of the grass where it's kind of jutting into view right here. And so I'm doing yellow ochre, and then I'm also doing some green grass here, and then I'm going to do some darker green as well to add even more contrast. When you add all of these different values, all these different lightness and darknesses of color on top of each other in watercolor, it just adds contrast and gives the eye different places to go, and it lets it see different things. And so that's kind of the look that we're going for here. Then as one final thing, I'm just going to take some dark green and push it upward from the bottom up into this grassy area. And there we go. It's not perfect, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be just like this loose representation of this reference photo, and I think it looks pretty cool. Thanks again for joining me for this YouTube tutorial where we took a look at a reference photo and turned it into a beautiful watercolor painting. If you like my stuff, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss my next tutorial. And if you decide to post your work to Instagram, make sure to tag me at this writing desk for a chance to be featured in my stories. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.